And it's a story about a certain man who was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. You may remember those, Mary and Martha. They come up a lot. Mary was the one who anointed Jesus with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let's go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going there again?" And Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the Twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Thomas was afraid, that this was a really bad idea, and the people who were out to get Jesus would get them all, but better that they be together. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, I know that God will give you whatever you ask it. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Even I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind men have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upwards and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. Okay. Just wanted to make sure there wasn't more. It is striking, of course, that Jesus was able to show how much he loved Lazarus and his sisters, Martha and Mary, and how deeply he felt the loss of his friend Lazarus. But it's also kind of confusing about why in the world Jesus would have waited so many days before coming to Lazarus. And I gotta say that this thing, well, this is so the glory of God will be shown, doesn't sound very convincing. At least, it wouldn't be convincing to me. I remember when Sam was in the hospital having brain surgery, and a friend of Steve's, who was also a pastor, came and sat by me out in the hallway. I was sitting on a bench, and she said, "Bridget, this will really help your ministry." And I thought, I could just do without it. I mean, what do you mean? Like this is supposed to happen so I'll be a better minister? That doesn't make any sense. And I imagine that some of the people with Jesus had the same thought. That just, why? And we know that Lazarus died again. But we also know that Lazarus and Jesus in this story, they have a lot in common. They both get buried or put in an opening in the stone, and then there's it's heavy. It's just a little crack, or big enough to get a body through, and then they put they roll a stone up to the end so that animals can't get in there, and that's it. And that's what they did with Jesus when they took him down from the cross. But then they roll away the stone, and Jesus is there again, and Lazarus is there again. And they both don't stay forever after that. It's not like they were made in invincible bodies. They still had human bodies. But in Lazarus's case, we get the idea that somehow he survived this. And in Jesus's case, we get the idea that something more happened. That in some way, his life after death is there for all of us and comes into us this way through the Spirit. So let's go back for a moment, well, for the rest of the sermon for that matter, talking about dry bones. Now, Lazarus hadn't been in there long enough to have dry bones, but it is God who tells Ezekiel to prophesy to these bare bones Now, when somebody has a compound fracture, which is something I really never want to see, it means one of the bones is, you can see the bone. And that's just kind of gross, because we would like our bones to stay in our body and be covered by sinew and all that other stuff with skin on top. And if the bone is protruding in some way, that's a danger signal. And yet, here in this valley, there's nothing but dry bones. And while Ezekiel is there, they have nothing on them. They've been picked clean, probably by the birds. And so the idea that these bones can live again is ludicrous. And when God asks Ezekiel, do you believe that these bones can live? It's like, your call, I know I can't make them live. And so God kind of walks him through this whole process. Prophesies to the bones and tell them, they can live again, and that they can come back together, and that they can be whole again. And then prophesy to the sinew and the skin, and each part will come back and fill in where they're supposed to be. And pretty soon, these bones will live again. And I'm told by our UCC woman who writes Bible studies and does some sermon seeds, that the way it's presented in Ezekiel is not that God literally took him to a valley, an actual valley. It's God allows him to see this valley with the dry bones, and to be able to look at it and say, I don't think it can live again. But then God says, try a little harder. And so as they go through this back and forth, and Ezekiel does what he's told. Now Ezekiel, he was in Babylon with the rest of the upper class after Jerusalem was taken. And so he's one of the guys that was probably in the temple in Jerusalem, which has been decimated. And he's been off in another country. And it's just the beginning of thinking, could we go back? And, getting back there is going to be a real issue, because the lower class people were left there to try and get along as best they could. And they're going to have their own ideas now on how things should be. And the upper class people are imagining that they're going to go back and just take the same position they were in before, and that'll be that. And, that's kind of naive. But I think there's a whole bunch of people who would have exactly the same thought if they were in that position. So what's happening here is God is asking Ezekiel to look a little harder at the situation, to not give up too quickly, and not to just walk off as though there's no hope, because that's what's happening. There is no hope. The people who've been in Babylon for a couple generations now, they're starting to take, some Babylonian ways and maybe worship a little with the Babylonians now and then, because they've been away from Israel for a while now. And they aren't really thinking they're going to go back anytime soon. And so that God gives them a pretty good push when he says, "Mortal, these gifts are the whole house of Israel." And they say, our bones are dried up and our hope is lost. We are cut off completely. That's what you would say, right? You've left Ukraine and you're living in another country and there's still a war going on in your homeland and it seems like it's never going to end. And you just say, there's no hope. There's a bully on the other side and bullies don't go away. And so we'll just stay here, I guess, and make the best of it. When I think about this, I gotta put this in just because I was struck when he says, then God said to me, prophesy to the breath, mortal, and say to the breath, thus says the Lord, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. And immediately what I thought, that sounds like a Native American thing, you know? The breath comes from the four winds and comes along and changes everything about what's going on. So as they're sitting there, well, they're not sitting there, but we're going to think just for a few more minutes about bones. Because, you know, focusing on the bones is pretty important. And you think about how the bones are like the structure that holds it all up, you know, and the bones of a house are those, David, no, those things at the very bottom, those that are put in first, that are bearing the whole weight of the rest of the house. And when people say to us, I was cut to the bone, it means a deep, deep cut. Or when they say, she doesn't have a mean bone in her body. Think about all the ways you hear expressions that rely upon the bones. You might even just say, well, that person has good bones, you know, they aren't weak and they aren't going to break in two suddenly. And so it is only when God has given Ezekiel instructions to really look at this valley, to really look at these bones, that Ezekiel is able to start seeing them in a new way. He sees the bones coming back together, and the sinew and the flesh and everything together, and being able to hold up the house of Israel. And so, when we hear, can these bones live? And we think about all the ways that we get into situations where we think there is no hope. There's nothing that can be done here. Might as well just walk away and give up. And maybe there are some times when realistically that's the only answer. But maybe sometimes we haven't opened our eyes enough to see the possibility of being able to make something out of this. When Ellie was doing her presentation, she started by talking about how easy it is to make anybody the other, and how you can also undo that by opening yourself up, maybe just a little bit, to some of these other people. And as you open yourself up, you don't see them as the other anymore. You see them as another person who happens to be a plumber and is now helping you out because you've reminded him of his mother who has died, and how much there is a way in which they're still connected because that's what mothers are all about. And you think, yeah, this is another real person. This isn't just somebody that I can put in a box. So that's all I have to say today about our scriptures, which I thought were pretty nice ones. So we're going to sing again.